walk people through what happened here, people that that may not have come across your situation just yet?
Sure. So basically, I had a son coming home after 2 years of living in the States. He was scheduled to go to school. He decided to go, and its program started on the 24th of February. And originally he was supposed to come home the 23rd, but we found out there was some in-class time that he needed to do. So we tried to get him home earlier so he could have like proper quarantine time before. And I had heard that there were some things coming down the pipeline, and I really wanted to get him home before the quarantining went into effect. So I had ordered him a test. He had that done on Friday. I knew what he needed. I looked up the regulations. I knew he needed the PCR test. I called and booked it, and the lady said, yes, I know what you need. And so she booked it. And he got the call on Saturday saying, you're good, you're clear, you're negative, you can go ahead. So he took the paperwork and got on a flight on Saturday. And when he came across the airport, everybody else came through and he didn't. So I already started to get a little bit nervous about that. And then he didn't have a phone number because he was living in the States, coming to Canada. So he left the plan, as he came. So he didn't really have a phone number that we could call, but he did have Facebook Messenger from the Wi-Fi. So he just put me on Facebook video messenger and just said, Mom, they're taking me to a quarantine center. And I said, what? No, they're not. And he said, Mom, they're not giving me a choice. They're just saying I have to go to the quarantine center. And I said, you are not going anywhere. Like, stay put. Let me figure out what's going on. Can I talk to them? And I desperately just tried to talk to anybody who would help me. He said, they're just not giving me a choice. They're making me go right now. And I said, you wait, like, give me 5 minutes. I'm going to make a phone call. You tell them you're not moving. And like, I heard him say, no, I'm staying here. I'm not going. And I hung up and I tried to call some of our friends for help and suggestions and what they thought, because they weren't even going to let me talk to him. They weren't going to let me see him. They weren't going to give me any answers. They just, I asked Ethan, why did they want to take you? Because as far as we knew, we did everything right. And he said, they said something was wrong with the test. And so they're taking me to the quarantine center. I hung up. I ran down the hallway to the border control people, and I asked them if they could get him, if they could let me see him. They just said, this is out of our hands. We have nothing to do with it. I asked if they could hold him on the US side while I figured it out. And they said, nope, this isn't our responsibility. And so I ran back, desperate. Ethan called me again from that side and he said, Mom, they're taking me. And I said, I do not give my consent. Don't move. And then the lady who was federal, anyway, it was the federal branch organization. She had listened to me the whole time when his speakerphone, because she was standing right there with him. And Ethan said, I do not give my consent. And she said, we don't need consent. And I said, you can't just take him. Like, that's illegal. I said, that's against the law. And she said, there is no law. So hung up, they were taking him. A sweet old man told me where they would be, and where they would be coming out to take him to the van. And so we did intercept them, my husband and I, and just stood in front of them and said, you can't do this. Please tell me where you're taking him. Please tell me, like, anything. And the answer was, we are taking him to an undisclosed location for an undisclosed amount of time. And like that, it was just surreal, right? It's every parent's worst nightmare. Never mind if it's your kid or your spouse or whatever. It's just unacceptable. They just kept going and passed, and Ethan kind of yelled at me, it's going to be okay, Mom, it's going to be okay. And so then they just took him to a black van and he was gone. So we're left there to drive home without our kid and without knowing why, where, when, and him either.
What turned out to be the problem?
So when I had ordered the test, I ordered the PCR test. The lady said, "Yep, I'll get it done. I know." And then he got the call saying he was negative, so it was all good. And then eventually found out that it was an antigen test that they had the paperwork for. She had ordered both tests. She ordered the antigen test and the PCR test just to make sure, but she didn't tell us that she did both. And so when we got the negative, we thought it was just for the PCR that we had ordered. The negative was actually for the antigen test. While he was sitting in the quarantine center Sunday morning, he got an email saying, "Your second test has come back negative." So he got both PCR and antigen test. They had only seen the antigen test. So that was their premise and their, for taking him, which we didn't know. And then the second test came back negative as well, but he couldn't tell anybody. Like, there was no soul to talk to. There was no communication with him, so he had 2 negative tests sitting in there and no way to let people know. The people who came into his room someone came in to take his temperature every day, and someone came in to take a test early on Sunday morning, which they had initially said they weren't doing any testing over the weekend, but I think they sped it up because I made such a big scene. But so they did their own test on the Sunday, and then the Monday he got his 3rd negative test, and they finally said he could go. And so somebody just put him in a van and took him back to the airport and dropped him off. And that was like pretty much his experience. Somebody did knock on the door and drop food, so he was fed, and he said there was a little box you could check with what you wanted, so he kind of had a choice in what he was going to eat. And other than that, there was just very little contact. You're kind of at their discretion of everything. And so it was just weird. It was just a really weird situation. Awful in the beginning, weird in the middle. And then you're kind of left to think about it. And for me, what really was the whole thing was that there was, one, no transparency, right? It just could have been dealt with so much better. 2, there's no accountability. Nobody's checking up on this. Nobody's checking up on this in the hotels. We're supposed to take it on faith that they're going to be looked after. When the lady said, "I'm going to have to call the police," I said, is that an option? Like, going to jail, is that an option? And she said, "No, that's not there are no options." But I would have felt better knowing that he was going to go to jail, where I knew where he was, where somebody is looking after him, where there's checks and balances, there's systems in place to hold people accountable. There isn't in this situation.
And having said that, he was in a hotel.
Yeah.
What was his experience in there like? What did he tell you afterwards?
Well, he just said that it was virtually very little contact. Nobody mistreated him, but it was just sitting around waiting for them to say, "Okay, see you later." There just wasn't really any contact. And he didn't know what was going. They were just waiting for the test to come back negative. And so, yeah, he said you just walked into a hotel and everything is like plastics down. There was a guard on his floor, and he did hear some other people on the floor, so there were other people with him. But yeah, it was just weird. Moving forward, the issue for me is, where is that accountability? I think it really needs to be there.
Right. So, and when you say accountability, exactly what do you want to know as a parent of a child that's taken away from you for a few days?
Well, that it's not just a one-sided decision-making process, right? It's not just, this is what's happening, and there's no checks and no balances and nobody watching to make sure that things are done properly, you know,
Make sure that your child's not afraid or something like
or
that.
unsafe.
Yeah. Okay.
Or that situations where nobody's watching and nobody's held accountable are often abused, you know?
Did they accept that second negative test, or did
Oh,
they
they didn't
wait
even
until
look
they're?
at it. They didn't look at it. They probably don't even know. I don't know. Nobody talked to them. It was just you're released. Some guy comes, picks them up, takes them to the van, takes them back to the airport.
Okay. And now, and what about the bill? We've heard that people are going to be stuck with an expensive bill. Is that the situation that you're facing?
Not so far. I haven't seen anything. I don't think it was fully implemented when this happened. So I haven't seen a bill.
What would you say to other people who are planning to come back to Canada on an airplane?
Oh man, you know, the whole process makes me very nervous and I don't like it at all. For me, if I had the choice, I would have, and this was our second option if I couldn't get him home in before the time limit. I would have flown him to the border on the US side, and I would have had someone drive him over to avoid this. I mean, I'm not okay with the unchecked quarantine centers. I personally don't agree. And I know there is a lot of, you know, there's people on all ends of the spectrum, but I don't want to be there. I wouldn't feel safe there. I didn't feel safe having my kid there. I don't like them. That's just my personal opinion. And I would have avoided it at all costs. So it's a hard call. You know, I'm glad that I have him home, but what if I just said, you know, maybe you want to stay there for a little while until, but are things going to change? I don't know if things are going to change.
Thank you very much, Rebekah. I sure appreciate your time. Is there anything else you want to share?
We've been facing comments and opposition, but also tremendous amounts of support and love. And it's been really interesting. I am not really used to being in the public eye, but I do feel like people just at least need to know what's going on so that we can bring some clarity to it. And then there needs to be the discussions and there needs to be changes.
If you could say what one or two changes that have to be implemented soon, what would they be?
Have to be, I would say, if this is allowed to continue, these quarantine centers, there has to be accountability and there has to be transparency. Those are the two. There has to be those things. Now, I don't necessarily like it, you know, I may not agree with it, but those things have to be in place.